Chapter Friday. Our story today is by an incredibly well-known author of fantasy books, and it is Brandon Sanderson's The Rithmatist. Just so you can see the pictures. Here's the prologue. Lily's lamp blew out as she bolted down the hallway. She threw the lamp aside, splashing oil across the painted wall and the fine rug. The liquid glistened in the moonlight. The house was empty, silent, save for her panicked breathing. She'd given up on screaming. Nobody had seemed to hear. It was as if the entire city had gone dead. She burst into the living room, then stopped, uncertain what to do. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, illuminated by the moonlight through the broad picture windows. The city skyline spread beyond, buildings rising 10 stories or more, spring rail lines crisscrossing between them. Jamestown, her home for all 16 years of her life. I am going to die, she thought. Desperation pushed through her terror. She shoved aside the rocking chair in the middle of the room, then hurriedly rolled up a rug so that she could get to the wooden floor. She reached into the pouch tied to a loop on her skirt and pulled out a single bone-white length of chalk. Kneeling on the wooden planks, staring at the ground, she tried to clear her mind. Focus! She set up the tip of the chalk against the ground and began to draw a circle around herself. Her hand shook so much that the line was uneven. Professor Fitch would have been quite displeased to see such a sloppy line of warding. She laughed to herself, a desperate sound, more of a cry. Sweat dripping from her brow, making dark spots on the wood. Her hand quivered as she drew several straight lines inside the circle. Lines of forbiddance, to stabilize her defensive ring. The Matson defense. How did it go? 2 smaller circles with bind points to place lines of making. Scratching. Lily snapped her head up, looking down the hallway at the door leading to the street. A shadow moved beyond the door's clouded window plate. Oh, Master, she found herself whispering, please, please. The door stopped rattling. All was still for just a moment. Then the door burst open. Lily tried to scream, but found her voice caught in her throat. A figure stood framed in the moonlight, a bowler hat on his head, a short cape covering his shoulders. He stood with his hand on a cane to his side. She could not see his face, backlit as he was, but there was something horribly sinister about that slightly tipped head and those shadowed features, a hint of a nose and chin reflecting in the moonlight, eyes that watched her from within the inky blackness. The things flooded into the room, all around him, angry, squirming, all over the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Their bone-white forms almost seemed to glow in the moonlight. Each was as flat as a piece of paper. Each was made with chalk. They were each unique, tiny, pitcher-like monsters with fangs and claws. They made no noise at all as they flooded into the hallway, hundreds of them, shaking and vibrating silently as they came for her. Lily finally found her voice and screamed. This is the imagery. Part 1, Chapter 1 begins with these images. Boring? Joel demanded, stopping in place. You think the 1888 Crew-Troy duel was boring? Michael shrugged, stopping and looking back at Joel. I don't know. I just stopped reading after a page or so. You're not just imagining it, right? Joel said, walking up and resting one hand on his friend's shoulder. He held his other hand in front of him, panning it as if to wipe away their surroundings, the green lawns of the Armedius Academy, and replace them with the dueling arena. Imagine, Joel said. It's the end of the melee, the biggest rithmatic event in the country. Paul Crewe and Adele Troy are the only two duelists left. Adele survived, against all odds, after her entire team was picked off in the first few minutes. A few other students stopped on the sidewalk to listen nearby as they passed between classes. So, Michael said, yawning. So, Michael, it was the finals! Imagine everyone watching in silence as the last two Rithmatists began their duel. Imagine how nervous Adele would have been. Her team had never won a melee before, and now she faced down one of the most skilled Rithmatists of her generation. Paul's team had shielded him at their center so that the lesser players fell first. They knew that they would get him to the end practically fresh, his defensive circle almost completely untouched. It was the champion against the underdog. Boring, Michael said. They just sit there and draw. You're hopeless, Joel replied. You're going to the very school where the Rithmatists are trained. Aren't you even a little interested in them? They have enough people interested in them, Michael said with a scowl. They keep to themselves, Joel. I'm fine with that. I'd rather they weren't even here. A breeze ruffled his blond hair. Around them spread the green hills and the stately brick buildings of the Armedius Academy. Nearby, a clockwork crab continued its quiet duty, chopping at the grass to keep it level. You wouldn't think that way if you understood, Joel said, getting out some chalk. Here, take this, and stand here. He positioned himself around his friend, then knelt and drew a circle on the sidewalk around him. Your policy, the defensive circle. If that gets breached, you lose the match. Joel paced back a ways on the concrete quad, then knelt and drew his own circle. Now, Adele's circle was nearly breached in 4 places. She quickly began to shift from the Matson defense to... okay, you know that. That's too technical. Just know that her circle was weak, and Paul had a strong, dominant position. If you say so, Michael said. He smiled at Eva Winters as she walked past, holding the books in front of her. Now, Joel said, Paul started pounding her circle with lines of vigor, and she knew she wouldn't be able to shift defenses quickly enough to recover. Pounding lines of what? Michael asked. Lines of vigor, Joel said. Duelists shoot them at each other. That's the point. It's how you breach the circle. I thought they made little chalk things, like creatures. Yeah, that too, Joel said. They're called chalklinks, but that's not why everyone remembers the 1888 melee, even some 20 years later. It was the lines she shot. Conventional wisdom would have been for her to last as long as she could, draw out the match, make a good showing of it. He set his chalk out in the front of his circle. She didn't do that, he whispered. She saw something. Paul had a small, weakened section at the back of his circle. Of course, the only way to attack it would be to bounce a shot off 3 different lines left by other duelists. It was an impossible shot. She took it anyway. She drew 1 line of vigor as Paul's chalklings ate her defenses, and she fired it and, caught up in the moment, Joel finished drawing the line of vigor in front of him, raising his hand with a flourish. With his surprise, he realized that some 30 students had gathered to listen to him, and he could feel them holding their breaths, expecting his drawing to come to life. It didn't. Joel wasn't a Rithmatist. His drawings were just ordinary chalk. Everyone knew that, Joel most of all, but the moment had somehow broken the spell of his story. The gathered students continued on their way, leaving him kneeling on the ground in the middle of his circle. And let me guess, Michael said, yawning again. Her shot got through? Yeah, Joel said, suddenly feeling foolish. He stood up, putting away his chalk. The shot worked. She won the melee, though her team had been the lowest favorite in the odds. The shot, though, it was beautiful, or at least so the accounts say. And I'm sure you'd love to have been there, Michael said, stepping out of the circle that Joel had drawn. By the master, Joel, I'll bet if you could travel through time, you'd waste it going to arithmetic duels. Sure, I guess. What else would I do? Oh, Michael said, maybe prevent some assassinations, get rich, find out what's really happening in Nebraska. Yeah, I suppose, Joel said, pocketing his chalk, and then jumping out of the way as a soccer ball shot past, followed by Jeff staring. Jeffs gave Michael and Joel a wave before chasing down his ball. All right, after a little intermission, I'm picking up. Okay. Joel joined Michael, continuing across the campus. The beautiful low green hills were topped by flowering trees and green vines wound their way up the sides of the buildings. Students started this way and that between the classes, in a variety of dresses and trousers. Many of the boys wore their sleeves rolled up in the late spring warmth. Only the Rithmatists were required to wear uniforms. That made them stick out. A group of 3 of them walked between buildings, and the other students casually made way, most not looking at them. Look, Joel, Michael said, have you ever wondered if maybe, you think about this stuff too much? Arithmetics and all that? It's interesting to me, Joel said. Yes, but I mean, it's a little odd, considering. Michael didn't say it, but Joel understood. He wasn't a Rithmatist, and could never be one. He'd missed his chance. But why couldn't he be interested in what they did? Michael narrowed his eyes as the group of 3 Rithmatists passed in their gray and white uniforms. It's kind of like, he said softly, it's kind of like it's us and them, Leave them alone to do whatever it is they do, Joel. You just don't like that they can do things you can't, Joel said. That earned Joel a glare. Perhaps those words hit too close to home. Michael was the son of a knight senator, a son of privilege. He wasn't used to being excluded. Anyway, Michael said, looking away and continuing to hike down the busy sidewalk, you can't be one of them, so why keep spending all your time talking about them? It's useless, Joel. Stop thinking about them. I can't ever be one of you either, Michael, Joel thought. Technically, he wasn't supposed to be at this school. Armedius was horribly expensive, and you either had to be important rich or a Rithmatist to attend. Joel was about as far from any of those 3 things as a boy could get. They stopped at the next intersection of sidewalks. Look, I've got to go to history class, Michael said. Yeah, Joel said. I got open period. Running messages again? Michael asked, in the hope that you'll get to peek into a arithmetic classroom. Joel blushed, but it was true. Summer's coming up, he said. You going to go home again? Michael brightened. Yeah, Father said I could bring some friends. Fishing, swimming, girls in sundresses on the beach. Sounds great, Joel said, trying to keep the hopeful tone out of his voice. I'd love to see something like that. Michael took a group each year, and Joel had never been invited. This year, though, well, he'd been hanging out with Michael after school. Michael needed help with math, and Joel could explain things to him. They had been getting along really well. Michael shuffled his feet. Look, Joel, he said, I mean, it's fun to hang out with you. Here, at school. But back home, it's a different world. I'll be busy with the family. Father has such expectations. Oh, yeah, of course, Joel said. Michael smiled, banishing all discomfort from his expression in an instant. Son of a politician, for sure. That's the spirit, he said, patting Joel on the arm. See ya! Joel watched him jog off. Michael ran into Mary Eisenhorn on the way, and he immediately started flirting. Mary's father owned a massive spring works. As Joel stood on that sidewalk, At the intersection, he could pick out dozens of members of the country's elite. Adam Lee was directly related to the Emperor of Joseon. Jeff Hamilton had 3 presidents in his family line. Wenda Smith's parents owned half the cattle ranches in Georgia, Bama. And Joel, he was the son of a chalk maker and a cleaner lady. Well, he thought, it looks like it'll just be me and Davis here all summer again. He sighed and then made his way to the campus office. 20 minutes later, Joel hurried back down the sidewalk, delivering messages around campus during his free period. Those sidewalks were now mostly empty of students, with everyone else in class. Joel's moment of depression had vanished the instant he looked through the sack. There had been only 3 messages to deliver today, and he'd done those quickly. That meant he clutched a 4th message in his pocket, one that he himself had added without telling anyone. Now, with some time to spare because of his speed earlier, he jogged up to Warden Hall, one of the Rithmatic lecture halls. Professor Fitch was teaching in there this period. Joel fingered the letter he carried in his pocket, penned, after some nervousness, to the Rithmatic professor. This might be my only chance, Joel thought, shoving down any nervousness. Fitch was a relaxed and pleasant man. There was no reason to be worried. Joel scurried up the long flight of steps outside the vine-covered gray brick building, and then slipped into the oak door. That brought him into the lecture hall at the very top. It was shaped like a small amphitheater, with tiered seats. Schematics depicting Rithmatic defenses hung on the whitewashed walls, and the plush seats were bolted in rows around, the tiers facing toward the lecture floor below. A few of the students glanced at Joel as he entered, but Professor Finch did not. The professor rarely noticed when he got deliveries from the office, and would ramble on for the entire lecture before realizing that a member of his audience wasn't actually a member of the class. Joel didn't mind one bit. He sat down on the steps eagerly. Today's lecture, it appeared, was on the Eastern Defense. Is why this defense is one of the very best to use against an aggressive assault from multiple sides, Fitch was saying down below. He pointed with a long red baton toward the floor where he had drawn a large circle. The hall was arranged so that the students could look down at his Rithmatic drawings on the ground. With his pointer, Fitch gestured toward the lines of forbiddance that he had affixed to the binding points of the circle. Now, the Eastern Defense is the most famous for the large number of smaller circles drawn at the bind points. Drawing 9 other circles like this can be quite time-consuming, but they will provide well enough in time for our defensive capabilities. You can see that the inner lines form an irregular nonagon, and the number of arms you leave off will determine how much room you have to draw, but also how stable your figure is. Of course, if you want a more aggressive defense, you can also use the bind points for chucklings. What about the lines of vigor? Joel thought. How do you defend against those? Joel didn't ask. He dare not draw attention to himself. That might make Fitch ask for his message, and that would leave Joel with no reason to keep listening. So Joel just listened. The office wouldn't expect him back for some time. He leaned forward, willing one of the other students to ask about the lines of vigor. They didn't. The young Rithmatists lounged in their seats, boys in white slacks, girls in white skirts, both in gray sweaters, colors to disguise the ever-present chalk dust. Professor Fitch himself wore a deep red coat. Thick, with straight starched cuffs, the coat reached all the way down to Fitch's feet. The coat buttoned up to a tall collar, mostly obscuring the white suit Fitch wore beneath. It had a militaristic feel to it, with all those stiff lines and straps at the shoulders, almost like a rank insignia. The red coat was the symbol of a full Rithmatic professor. And that is why a Kabbalah defense is inferior to the Eastern in most situations. Professor Fitch smiled, turned to regard the class. He was an older man, graying at the temples, and with a spindly figure. The coat gave him an air of dignity. Do you understand what you have? Joel thought, looking over the unengaged students. This was a class of 15 and 16-year-old students, making them Joel's age. Despite their noble calling, they acted like teenagers. Fitch was known to run a loose classroom, and many of the students took advantage, ignoring the lecture, whispering with friends or lounging, and staring at the ceiling. Several near Joel actually appeared to be sleeping. He didn't know their names. Didn't know the names of most of the arithmetic students. They generally rebuffed his attempts to chat with him. When nobody spoke, Fitch knelt and pressed his chalk against the drawing he'd done. He closed his eyes. Seconds later, the drawing puffed away, willed by its creator to vanish. Well then, he said, raising his chalk, if there are no questions, perhaps we can discuss how to beat an Eastern defense. The more astute of you will have noticed that I made no mention of lines of vigor. That is because those are better talked about from an offensive viewpoint. If we were to... The door to the lecture hall banged open. Fitch rose, chalk held between two fingers, eyebrows raised as he turned. A tall figure strode into the room, causing some of the lounging students to perk up. The newcomer wore a gray coat after the style of a arithmetic professor of lower rank. His coat fit him well, buttoned up to the chin, loose through the legs. Joel didn't know him. Yes? Professor Fitch asked. The newcomer walked all the way to the floor of the lecture hall, passing Professor Fitch and pulling out a piece of red chalk. The newcomer turned, knelt, and placed his chalk against the ground. Some of the students began to whisper. What is this? Fitch asked. I say, did I pass my lecture time again? I heard no sound of the clock. I'm terribly sorry if I've intruded onto your time. The newcomer looked up. His face seemed smug to Joel. No, Professor, the man said. This is my challenge. Fitch looked stunned. Fitch licked his lips nervously, then wrung his hands. I'm not sure what I need to do. Ready yourself to draw, Professor, the newcomer said. Fitch blinked. Then, hands obviously shaking, he got down on his knees to place his chalk against the ground. That's Professor Andrew Nelazar, whispered a girl seated a short distance from Joel. He gained his coat just 3 years ago from the Mainford Academy. They say he spent the last 2 years fighting in Nebraska. He's handsome, the girl's companion said, twirling a bit of chalk between her fingers. Down below, the two men began to draw. Joel leaned forward, excited. He had never seen a real duel between two professors before. This might be as good as being at the melee. Both began by drawing circles around themselves to block attacks from the other opponent. Once either circle was breached, the duel would end. Perhaps because he had been talking about it, Professor Fitch went to draw the Eastern defense, surrounding himself with 9 smaller circles touching the larger one at the bind points. It wasn't a very good stance for a duel. Even Joel could see that. He felt a moment of disappointment. Maybe this wouldn't be that good a fight after all. Fitch's defense was beautifully drawn, but was too strong. The Eastern was best against multiple opponents who surrounded you. Nelazar drew a modified Ballantine defense, a quick defense with only basic reinforcements. While Professor Fitch was still placing his internal lines, Nalazar went straight into aggressive attack, drawing chalklings. Chalklings, drawn from lines of making, they were the core offense of many rithmatic fights. Nalazar drew quickly and efficiently, creating chalklings that looked like small dragons with wings and sinuous necks. As soon as he finished the first, it shook to life, and then it flew across the ground toward Fitch. It didn't rise into the air. Chalklings were two-dimensional, like all rithmatic lines. The battle played out on the floor, lines attacking other lines. Fitch's hands were still shaking, and he kept looking up and down as if nervous and unfocused. Joel cringed as the middle-aged professor drew one of his outer circles lopsided, a major mistake. The instructional diagram he had drawn earlier had been far more precise. Lopsided curves were easy to breach. Fitch paused, looking at the poorly drawn curve, and he seemed to doubt himself. "Come on!" Joel clenched his fists. "You're better than this, Professor!" As the second dragon began to move across the ground, Fitch recovered his wits and snapped his chalk back against the floor. The gathering students were silent, and those who had been dozing sat up. Fitch threw up a long, wiggly line, a line of vigor. It was shaped like a waveform, and when it was finished, it shot across the board to hit one of the dragons. The blast threw up a puff of dust and destroyed half of the creature. The dragon began to wriggle about, moving in the wrong direction. The only sounds in the room were those of chalk against the floor, accompanied by Fitch's quick, almost panicked breathing. Joel bit his lip as the duel became heated. Fitch had been a better defense, but he'd rushed it, leaving sections that were weak. Nalazar's sparse defense allowed him to go aggressive, and Fitch had to struggle to keep up. Fitch continued throwing up lines of vigor, destroying the chalk creatures that flew across the board at him, but there were always more to replace them. Nalazar was good, among the very best Joel had ever seen. Despite the tension, Nalazar remained fluid, drawing chalkling after chalkling, unfazed by those that Fitch destroyed. Joel couldn't help but be impressed. "He's been fighting the wild chalklings at Nebraska recently," Joel thought, remembering what the girl had said. "He's used to drawing under pressure." Nalazar calmly sent some spider chalklings to crawl along the perimeter of the floor, forcing Fitch to watch his flanks. Next, Nalazar began sending across lines of vigor. The snaky lines shot across the board in a vibrating waveform, vanishing once they hit something. Fitch finally managed to get out a chalkling of his own, a knight, a beautifully detailed one, which he bound to one of his smaller circles. How does he draw them so well, yet so fast? Joel wondered. Fitch's knight was a work of beauty. Here's a picture of it. Let's see. There you go. With detailed armor and a large greatsword, it easily defeated Nalazar's more plentiful, yet far more simply drawn dragons. With the knight set up, Fitch could try some more offensive shots. Nalazar was forced to draw a few defensive chalklings, blob creatures that threw themselves in front of the lines of vigor. Armies of creatures, lines, and waveforms flew across the board, a tempest of white against red, chalklings puffing away, lines hitting the circles and blasting out chunks of the protective line. Both men scribbled furiously. Joel stood, then took an almost involuntary step down toward the front of the room, transfixed. Doing so, however, let him catch a glimpse of Professor Fitch's face. Fitch looked frantic, terrified. Joel froze. The professor kept drawing, but that worry in Fitch's expression pulled Joel away from the conflict. Such desperate motions, such concern, his face streaked with sweat. The weight of what was happening crashed down on Joel. This wasn't a duel of fun or practice. This was a challenge to Fitch's authority, a dispute over his right to hold his tenure. If he lost... One of Nalazar's red lines of vigor hit Fitch's circle straight on, almost breaching it. Immediately, all of Nalazar's chalklings moved in that direction, a frenzied, chaotic mess of red motion toward the weakened line. For just a moment, Fitch froze, looking overwhelmed. He shook himself back into motion, but it was too late. He couldn't stop them all. One of the dragons got past his knight. It began to claw furiously at the weakened part of Fitch's circle, distorting it further. Fitch hurriedly began to draw another knight, but the dragon ripped through his border. "No!" Joel cried, taking another step down. Nalazar smiled, removing his chalk from the floor and standing. He dusted off his hands. Fitch was still drawing. Here's a picture of the attack. There. You guys see it in the corner. "Professor?" "Professor," Nalazar said. "Professor!" Fitch stopped, and only then did he notice that the dragon, which continued to work on a hole, trying to dig itself out enough that it could get into the center of the circle. In a real battle, it would have moved in to attack the Rithmatist himself. This, however, was just a duel, and a breach in the ring meant victory for Nalazar. "Oh," Fitch said, lowering his hand. "Oh, yes, well, I see." He turned, seeming dazed, regarding the room full of students. Yes, I will just go then." He began to gather up his books and notes. Joel sank down onto the stone steps. In his hand he held the letter he had written to give to Fitch. "Professor," Nalazar said, "your coat?" Fitch looked down. Yes, of course." He undid the buttons on the long red coat, then pulled it off, leaving him in his white vest, shirt, and trousers. He looked diminished. Fitch held the coat for a moment, then laid it on the lecture desk. He gathered up his books and fled the chamber. The door to the ground floor entrance clicked shut softly behind him. Joel sat stunned. A few of the members of the classroom clapped timidly, though most just watched wide-eyed, obviously uncertain how to react. "Now then," Nalazar said, voice curt, "I will take over instruction of this class for the last few days of the term, and I will be teaching the summer elective course that Fitch had planned. I have heard reports of rather disgraceful performance among the students of Armedius, your cohort in particular. I will allow no sloppiness in my class. You there, boy, sitting on the steps." Joel looked up. "What are you doing there?" Nalazar demanded. "Why aren't you wearing your uniform?" "I'm not a Rithmatist, sir," Joel said, standing. "I'm from the general school." "What? Why in the name of the heavens are you sitting in my classroom?" "Your classroom? This is Fitch's classroom, or it should be." "Well?" Nalazar asked. "I came with a note, sir," Joel said, "for Professor Fitch." "Hand it over, then," Nalazar said. "It's for Professor Fitch personally," Joel said, stuffing the letter in his pocket. "It wasn't about the class." "Well, be off with you, then," Nalazar said, dismissing Joel with a wave of his hand. The red chalk dust scattered on the floor, looking like blood. He began dispelling the creations one at a time. Joel backed away, then rushed up the steps and opened the door. People crossed the lawn outside, many dressed in the white and gray of Rithmatists. One figure stood out. Joel dashed down the stairs across the springy lawn, catching up to Professor Fitch. The man trudged with slumped shoulders, the large bundle of books and notes collected in his arms. "Professor!" Joel said. Joel was tall for his age, a few inches taller even than Fitch. The older man turned with a start. What? Are you all right?" "Oh, why, it's the chalkmaker's son.
How are you, lad? Shouldn't you be in class?
It's my free period, Joel said, reaching and sliding 2 of the books off the stack to help carry them. Professor, are you all right? About what just happened?
You saw that, did you?
Professor Fitch's face fell. Isn't there anything you could do? Joel asked. You can't let him just take your classes away. Perhaps if you spoke to Principal York.
No, Fitch said. That would be unseemly. The right challenge is a very honorable tradition, an important part of the rithmatic culture, I must say.
Joel sighed. He glanced down, remembering the note in his pocket. A request from him to Fitch. He wanted to study with the man over the summer, to learn as much about rithmatics as he could. But Fitch wasn't a full professor any longer. Would that matter? Joel wasn't even certain the man would take a non-rithmatic student. If Fitch wasn't full professor, he might have more time for tutoring students. Thinking that immediately made Joel feel guilty. He almost pulled the letter out and gave it to the man. The defeat in Fitch's face stopped him. Perhaps this wasn't the best time.
I should have seen this coming, Fitch said. That Nalazar, too ambitious for his own good. I thought when we hired him last week that there hasn't been a challenge in Armedius for decades.
What will you do? Joel asked.
Well,
Fitch said as he walked along the path, passing under the shade of a well-limbed red oak.
Yes, well, tradition states that I take Nalazar's place. He was hired as a tutoring professor to help remedial students who failed classes this year. I guess that's my new job now. I should think I'll be happy to be away from the classroom, to have peace of mind.
He hesitated, turning to look back toward the rithmatic lecture hall. The structure was block-shaped and yet somehow still artistic, with its diamond patterns of gray bricks forming the vine-covered wall.
Yes, Fitch said. I will probably never have to teach in that classroom again.
He choked off the last part.
Excuse me.
And he ducked his head and he rushed away. Joel raised a hand but let him go, still holding 2 of the professor's books. Finally Joel sighed, turning his own course across the lawn toward the campus office building. Well, he said softly, thinking again of the crumpled paper in his trouser, that was a disaster. As you may have surmised, things do not go very easily for our lead hero, and his desire to become a Rithmatist does wind up compelling him to assist when some very dark things start happening on campus. The desire to learn is admirable. I love that about this character. I love the creativity of the types of dark things that happen with these trucklings, and the book is great for hiding who the actual bad person is, and I enjoyed the relationships of the story, and I highly recommend it. I hope you pick it up and read the whole story yourself. Take care.